Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 1043 for February 11th, 2024. Coming up in a few minutes.
The people that really succeeded at the game, spent 10 hours a day, many days a week, just driving around into inner city and rural liquor stores looking for things. It's a real kind of obsessive hobby if you wanted to succeed at it.
This week we're going to look at the world of dusty hunters. Those are people who scour obscure liquor stores looking for vintage bottles that may have gone unnoticed for years. Aaron Goldfarb has been chronicling this community of obsessed whiskey and spirits collectors. His new book is Dusty Booze, and he'll join us on this week's WhiskyCast In-Depth. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, behind the label, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
Greetings, everyone. It's Gabriel Cardarello with Jewers, and I have big news. Jewers is about to unveil the first chapter of a 4-part collector series dedicated to honoring the most famous whiskey-producing regions of Scotland. More on that in a bit.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. U.S. sales of whiskeys and other distilled spirits were flat during 2023 compared to the previous year. New data released this week by the Distilled Spirits Council shows sales only gained 0.2%, while volume increased by just 1.2%. Bourbons and other American whiskeys continued to show growth, up nearly 4%, but 2023 was a year of retrenchment, according to economist Martin Lodovics of IWSR Drinks Analysis.
They were dealing with record credit card debt. They were dealing with high interest rates, inflation, prices being pushed through the system, global uncertainty in terms of wars popping up. So there was just a general negative sentiment in 2023, and consumers were quite clearly both saying and acting to be a little bit more conscious of where they were. I think now as some of the sort of macroeconomic fundamentals are starting to improve, inflation coming down, I would expect that the return to the norm with continued strong growth in premiumization. And maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I'm one of the people that's actually betting that a return to premiumization is hopefully soon.
After years of steady growth, Irish whiskies took a hit in 2023, down 19.4% in revenue growth over 2022. That is significant since the U.S. is the largest single market for Irish whiskey, but Alex Cunningham of Slane Irish Whiskey described it as a short-term blip.
The declines that are going on in the U.S. at the moment are not unique to Irish. This is also affecting other categories as well. I actually think it's more to do with some changes in how the US market is working. We're all affected by the cost of borrowing, and I think, paying for inventory and holding stock is costing more money. And as a result of that, I think people are running leaner inventories. And what's actually happening is that there's quite a lot of stock in the system that needs to work its way through before people start, reordering in the same rate. So I actually see this because looking at the U.S. economy, I actually think that this is a short-term kind of blip that is going to right itself once the system corrects itself and that inventory management change has worked its way through the system.
Single Malt Scotch whiskies were down in revenue by 8.5%, while Canadian whiskies were off by nearly 6%. One bright note from the Discus report, American whiskey exports are up 64% year-over-year for the period from January through October of last year and have recovered in the European Union to pre-tariff levels. The 27 EU member nations account for 44% of all American whiskey exports. Elsewhere, bourbon production has been shown to have a $9 billion annual impact on Kentucky's economy. The biennial report from the Kentucky Distillers Association showed 23,000 jobs can be linked to the whiskey industry, making it one of the Commonwealth's largest employers. Kentucky distillers accounted for nearly 25% of the federal government's entire revenue from alcohol excise taxes last year, with nearly $2 billion in tax payments during 2023, along with $358 million in state and local taxes. Kentucky distillers also purchased 70% of their grain supplies from the state's farmers, with 21 million bushels of corn and other grains accounted for during 2023. In other news, Diageo has entered the American single malt business with Bulleit Single Malt Whiskey. The sourced whiskey is the latest entry in this fast-growing segment of the whiskey market and is aged entirely in new American oak. It'll sell for around $60 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. Meanwhile, Diageo's Port Ellen distillery is on track to reopen next month, and ahead of the opening, there's a new luxury release of Port Ellen from 1978. Port Ellen Gemini is a set of two 1978 single malts. Original cask comes from European oak butts, while the remnant cask is a unique blend of single malts from different filling runs at Port Ellen that was rescued from the distillery shortly before it closed in 1983 and kept on Islay for 40 years. The two-bottle set will sell for 45,000 pounds each. Just 274 sets will be available worldwide. Bruichladdich is out with two vintage malts, a 30-year-old featuring whiskies distilled before Bruichladdich closed between 1994 and 2001, and an 18-year-old with whiskey distilled shortly after the distillery reopened. The 18-year-old sells for $180 a bottle, while the 30-year-old will sell for around $2,000 each. Glencadam Distillery has released two limited edition single malts, the 15-year-old Reserva de Madeira cask finish, and the 17-year-old Reserva PX finished in Pedro Jimenez quarter casks. Only 5,826 bottles of the Reserva de Madeira will be available at 110 pounds a bottle, while just 4,188 bottles of the Reserva PX will be available at 150 pounds each. Woodford Reserve is out with its annual batch-proof bourbon. This year's edition came in at 60.6% ABV, with barrels coming from the upper floors of Woodford's rickhouses. The limited edition release is available in the U.S. and select global markets, with a recommended retail price of $150 each. In other news, Whiskey Magazine handed out its U.S. awards Thursday night at a ceremony in Louisville. In the World Whiskies Awards, Sazerac's 1792 aged 12 years was named the world's best bourbon. Law's Whiskey House in Denver won world's best small batch bourbon honors for its 4-grain bourbon. Four Roses won best single barrel bourbon honors, and Breckenridge Port Cask Finish won world's best finished bourbon. Uncle Nearest 1856 was named the world's best Tennessee whiskey. Other top U.S. whiskeys will compete for World's Best honors to be announced next month ahead of Whiskey Live London. In the U.S. Icons of Whiskey Awards, Heaven Hill was named Distiller of the Year, while Balcones Distilling was named Craft Producer of the Year. Old Elk's Greg Metz was named Master Distiller / Blender of the Year, and Iron Root Republic's Marcia Licorice was named Distillery Manager of the Year. Buffalo Trace was named the Visitor Attraction of the Year, and Buffalo Trace's Freddie Johnson was named to Whiskey Magazine's Hall of Fame, along with Michter's founder Joe Magliocco. Finally, we don't mention whiskey raffles very often, but Sazerac's Single Barrel Select program is raffling off a barrel of Blanton's Gold Bourbon to benefit St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. The winner will get a VIP tour and barrel selection at Buffalo Trace, along with $20,000 to buy bottles from the selected barrel. Tickets are $100 each. The raffle begins Monday and runs through February 29th. We have a link for more details in the show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. That's also where you can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Let's check the calendar and see what's coming up around the world of whiskey. Julio's Liquors in Westborough, Massachusetts has a Westland whiskey tasting this Wednesday night. Catoctin Creek Distilling in Purcellville, Virginia has its annual Valentine's Day dinner on Friday night. Saturday will be busy in Texas with the Galaxy Whiskey Gala in Austin and the Legends of Texas Whiskey Festival in Waco. Tickets are still available for the Fraser History Museum's Blue Run Bourbon event on the 21st. Drinkmonger in Edinburgh, Scotland has a tasting that pits Scotch whiskies against English whiskies on the 21st as well. The Whiskey Wonderland is February 22nd through the 24th in Hammond, Ontario. Julio's Liquors has its annual Go Whiskey Week of events from the 26th through March 3rd. And the Kentucky Derby Museum's next Bourbon Legends series features Brent Elliott of Four Roses on the 28th in Louisville. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it. We'll add it to the searchable calendars at whiskycast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Kentucky and Ireland have plenty in common. Two homes of horse racing. Bluegrass music is said to have Irish roots. Okay, it's not the longest list, but the Redbreast Kentucky Oak Edition only strengthens the bond. Finished in sustainably sourced Kentucky oak for a captivating nose and round taste. I see a triple crown in this thoroughbred's future.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock and the Classic Malts lineup. We don't talk much on WhiskyCast about dusty hunters, those collectors who specialize in rare bottles of vintage whiskeys from distilleries and brands that have long been defunct. Well, that changes this week. Aaron Goldfarb has been writing about dusty hunters for several years now, and his new book, Dusty Booze, will be published on March 5th. What kind of people spend their entire lives, it almost seems like, obsessed over finding dusty bottles of whiskey and other spirits?
Well, I've asked myself that before, and I guess it's not quite me because I never fully went into the game, in earnest. The first guy who ever told me about it was Josh Peters, who blogs under the name The Whiskey Jug. A lot of you out there might know him. This was probably circa 2012 or 2013, and he told me, he'd drive around Los Angeles going into liquor stores and searching for, old bottles that people might not recognize were old and good. I think he's a pretty normal guy, but, some other people in the industry are a little stranger. I mean, you have to have an obsession. You have to, the people that really succeeded at the game, spent 10 hours a day, many days a week, just driving around into inner city and rural liquor stores looking for things. It's a real kind of obsessive hobby if you wanted to succeed at it.
I find it fascinating just because we focus on new spirits and new releases here at WhiskyCast for the most part, but it is fun to go searching for those dusties every once in a while.
Yeah, I became interested in vintage because at a certain point, all this allocated stuff was getting so expensive. And I started thinking, well, wow, Pappy Van Winkle or George T. Stagg comes out and whatever Buffalo Trace says the retail price is, we know that's not the price, they're going to charge, and everyone scrambles to find it. But then 365 days later, it's released again. And I was saying, but, all this great stuff from the past, Stitzel Weller stuff, until recently was cheaper than a lot of the brand new releases. I'm saying you can drink this vintage, in my opinion, often superior stuff made by defunct distilleries, and it's cheaper than the new hottest thing. And it just made no sense to me. And that was one thing that really captured my imagination with vintage spirits.
And it's also a chance to taste a bit of the past too, right?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Pre-Fire Heaven Hill, which is only dating before 1996, so it's a fairly recent past. I like current Heaven Hill too, but the Pre-Fire Heaven Hill just has a very thick, rich mouthfeel, even even if it's 80 proof, that just doesn't really exist in whiskey these days, or at least American whiskey. And so you have to start asking yourself, well, why was this occurring? You know, Wild Turkey from the 80s has what people describe as this kind of funk that, again, doesn't really exist in Wild Turkey today, which I'm also a fan of, the modern Wild Turkey. So again, you have to ask yourself, why is this going on? Why was National Distillers' Old Granddad so damn good? And there's, theories on all of this.
Let's go through some of those theories. Let's talk about Old Granddad, because it's a brand that deserves more love than it gets.
Yeah.
From history.
Yeah. I thought I'd drink a vintage Old Granddad on the show. So, yeah. So Old Granddad, and you might even know more than me, used to be made by a now defunct distillery called National Distillers. They also made Old Crow, right? And Old Taylor too, I believe.
Got absorbed into Beam, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating story. 1987, no one's drinking bourbon, as you know. Certainly no one's drinking rye. And the hottest thing going are kind of peach schnapps drinks, Sex on the Beach, the Fuzzy Navel. Jim Beam spends $545 million in 1987 to acquire De Cooper's Peachtree Schnapps from National Distillers. And thrown in as an afterthought in the deal are Old Granddad, Old Taylor, Old Overholt, and I think Old Crow too. Just take this bourbon and rye no one else wants. And of course, today, those are the things everyone wants. And Beam Suntory's had great success with kind of reimagining these brands, but they don't taste the same as they obviously did when they were made by other companies.
Let's talk about Wild Turkey, because we know one guy's been in charge for all those years, in Jimmy Russell. But what can explain the funk in those old bottlings that we don't see today? And I'm wondering if it was the switch in distilleries when they went from the old distillery to the new one.
Yeah, and I mean, if you talk to the Russells, they'll say it tastes exactly the same. I think Wild Turkey today is very delicious, I should say. It could be a switch in distilleries. I think the fact that they used to ferment in cedar and wood has to have created a sort of house signature microflora. Again, I think the Russells claim that's not true, but I think if you're aware of the open fermentation wineries or the lambic breweries of Belgium, you can't help but get house bugs into the mash. And I think that might be what did it. Corn was obviously different. Entry proof was different back then. I think a lower entry proof is what gives lower proof bourbons a richer mouthfeel than we get today from lower proof bourbons. Oak trees were chopped down at an older age to make barrels back then. There's lots of possible reasons, and it might be all those reasons combining.
You talk a lot in the book about trying to find the lost stash of Howard Hughes.
Yes.
Explain this stash and where it finally wound up.
Well, so this kind of legendary Dusty Hunter, Kevin Langdon Ackerman, who is also a movie memorabilia expert and collector, he found director Cecil B. DeMille's booze collection in 2020, which I wrote about for the New York Times, and which kind of led to this book deal. After that, he told me I got an even bigger celebrity I'm chasing, and I eventually got out of him. It was Howard Hughes, the eccentric billionaire shut-in by the end of his life. The story goes, apparently he dies in 1976, and his legendary offices at 7000 Romaine Street in Los Angeles are sealed shut. Company eventually shifts over to another company, but Howard Hughes's office apparently stays sealed this whole time. No one's looting it for things, and workers eventually leak out to kind of dusty owners and friends. You wouldn't believe it. Howard Hughes's office is still intact. There's still a bar cart. There's still booze on it. So Kevin starts trying to figure out how he can extract it. I can spoil it or not for you, but by the end of the book, I have tasted at least one bottle of Howard Hughes's bourbon.
Well, we might as well spoil it a little bit. It winds up in the hands of another Dusty Hunter.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, anyone listening to this can theoretically go taste Howard Hughes's booze. It ends up at a really elegant vintage spirits tasting room in Seattle called the Doctor's Office. 12-seater bar, pretty reasonably priced considering what he has. But yeah, he's got an entire Howard Hughes collection on the menu, everything from 1946 Old Overholt, something called Coon Hollow Bourbon, and some gins, Canadian whiskeys, blended whiskeys, you name it.
What's the holy grail out there that's still out there that we're looking for in terms of bourbon?
That's a good question. The holy grail of probably all vintage is Ray and Nephew 17-year-old, which Appleton Estates kind of tried to reimagine this year with Legend 17. The holy grail of bourbon, that's a great question. There's lots of things that are just great and people love, but I'm not sure if there's like the Ray and Nephew, we're aware there's 2 bottles on planet Earth, and we don't know if there are any more, and those 2 bottles are not open, and they might never be opened. So to find a third or a fourth or to ever open a bottle would be big, big news in the vintage game. I don't think there's quite a bourbon like that, but there were so many distilleries in the past, as you know, that there may be, as what Donald Rumsfeld said, unknown unknowns out there that we don't even know about. We say, wow, we didn't know Pappy Van Winkle distilled this thing at Stitzel-Weller in 1965, and this has been a holy grail we didn't even know we should have been chasing the whole time.
What's the future for vintage collecting?
Well, when I started this book, I thought, well, this has got to be a dying industry and a dying hobby. Vintage spirits are innately they're a non-renewable resource. Well, a lot of vintage collectors who started in bourbon are moving on to other things, tequila, rum, liqueurs. I started drinking whiskey in 2020. That's vintage whiskey now. I don't know if it's as good a vintage whiskey as, Old Granddad from 1979, but, sit around a while. I'm sure, Mark, you bought bottles that are still in your house that would now be considered vintage whiskey. So I've come to believe that, vintage wine never quit existing. There's gobs of vintage wine all over planet Earth. Every restaurant has vintage wine. So I think eventually vintage spirits and especially vintage whiskey are going to settle into a space like that where top restaurants and top bars just have a small vintage spirits menu.
We have to talk about the legality of all this because
yes,
it's illegal in most states to buy vintage spirits from somebody who's been collecting them or to buy and sell them. A handful of states allow it.
Yes. Kentucky, Tennessee, kind of. New York actually does, which a lot of people don't know. Washington, D.C. is the Wild West, as we all know, in alcohol. North Carolina. I think that's it right now. Most other states kind of just don't pay attention to it. But there's multi-million-dollar collections out there that are existing in kind of a fuzzy gray area of legality. I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but it doesn't seem like the ATF particularly cares. It's not, as one guy says in the book, Gary Crunkleton, who owns vintage spirits bars in North Carolina, well, he's quoting someone who says it's not legal, but it's not illegal per se.
It's illegal if you really applied the letter of the law saying that you can't sell alcohol without a liquor license, but we can go.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, if you go to a bar that's only been open since 2010 and they have Prohibition era Old Overholt, well, are they going to claim they bought that through the standard chain of command? I mean, it'd be a lot of work. Where they purchased it was probably illegal, but if they're paying taxes and selling it, that's technically not illegal. It is a gray area. There really haven't been many cases of people getting in trouble. A few big ones, of course, but.
And then all the Facebook groups that got shut down a few years ago when Facebook finally decided to crack down along with eBay. which
Yeah.
was also the Wild West for a while too, right?
Yeah, I mean, people really early in the game, eBay shut down in 2012, but before 2012, you could search for Ray and Nephew 17-year-old and maybe it would appear. The Facebook groups got cleared out when, Mark Zuckerberg was being called to Congress for selling things on Facebook he didn't even know about. They've, to a certain extent, reappeared. To be clear, vintage spirits are still being sold on Facebook, just a lot more discreetly, a lot more hidden, and a lot more secretly.
If someone wanted to get into vintage spirits collecting now, what would you tell them to do? Would you tell them it's too late, or to steer them to other spirits other than whiskey? Because all those little country liquor stores have been cleaned out by now.
Mostly, yeah. There's still a crazy story or two every year, but I always tell people, don't buy the whole cow. Go to some of these great bars like Cannon or Neat in Louisville or Jack Rose, and why don't you start tasting vintage stuff and seeing if this is really something you want to pursue? But the vintage market has mostly moved to auction, where, to be clear, there are still pretty good deals in certain categories. You can find some incredible stuff. No, you're not going to find Stitzel-Weller at a good deal anymore. That ship has passed. Probably Wild Turkey too. Probably National Distillers, anything. And certainly vintage Scotch has long blown up. But yeah, there's plenty of great auction houses. Some exclusively devoted to both whiskey and vintage whiskey. So creep around on those and see if anything intrigues you, and maybe you'll find, a special bottle.
Let's turn from the collectors to the finders, those people who have lost a relative, a grandfather, or someone who had a spirits collection of sorts. I get this question probably at least once every couple of months. Somebody will email me and say, I got this bunch of stuff that my grandfather left behind, or a relative left behind, and we got to get rid of it. How do I get rid of it legally? And I keep telling them, you got to go to an auction house.
Yeah.
Because they're the only ones who are licensed, really, unless you live in Kentucky or one of these states that allow vintage sales.
Yeah. And, as I mentioned in the book, when my grandfather died, he just left me with some sticky Midori from the 80s. So, grandpa wasn't much of a whiskey drinker, unfortunately. Yeah, the auction houses are probably the quickest and most fair way to move a lot. To be clear, they're going to take a nice little cut. But if you're someone who doesn't know a ton about how things are priced, there's no way you're going to even know where to go, what to price things at, and how to sell bottles piecemeal. Maybe you'll know a guy in the neighborhood who'll buy the whole lot from you. Maybe you'll know a collector who will then Venmo you a big chunk of change, which, again, is technically illegal. But yeah, the auction houses will assess your collection and pretty fairly assess your collection. They're not going to try to fleece you. That's what I do with a big lot, for sure.
What was the most unusual thing you found that you got to taste while you were writing this book?
Oh, that's a good question. I've been tasting vintage alcohol for about a decade. I've always been fascinated by it. I'm trying to think of that. I once I drank some real British Navy rum that they gave the Navy men back pre, I guess, 1974. You got a tot a day, which I think was like an ounce or something. So I tasted that. Spectacular, I should say. I've tasted unlabeled demijohn of 1800s rye from America, unclear where it came from. That was also absolutely spectacular. And I've tasted a lot of very kind of obscure Italian Amaro, just mom and pop Amaro made in Italy in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Everyone was making Amaro back then. Only one of them became Campari. The rest of them were forgotten to history, but that doesn't mean they weren't good.
Anything unusual that popped up?
Well, I really like to taste decanters. And if you don't know, during the bourbon glut of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, to sell whiskey, A lot of producers were putting it into goofy decanters that included, famously, Old Crow put their bourbon into gigantic chess pieces. You could buy 32 different chess pieces, ceramic decanters of Old Crow, which would come with a giant chessboard that you could theoretically play a giant game of chess with. But this is some of the greatest bourbon ever bottled. A lot of people have said this. This isn't a hot take I'm professing, but the whole chess set now goes for $30,000 to $50,000. But everyone was putting things in decanters: Jim Beam, Wild Turkey, Stitzel-Weller. And sometimes you'll find something, an Elvis decanter or a King Tut decanter from Michter's, and it seems goofy, but there might be something quite tasty in there.
Once again, Aaron Goldfarb's new book, Dusty Booze, will be published on March 5th, and we have a link to pre-order copies in the show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. You can also catch Aaron in the Vice TV series Tailgaters and the Spirits Network series The Tipping Point. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. Let's kick off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with the new Bulleit American Single Malt that I mentioned during the news. Again, it's a sourced whiskey bottled at 45% ABV. The nose is dry, dusty, and malty with touches of honey and butterscotch. The taste has a good balance of spiciness and malty character, with white pepper and clove balanced by barley sugar, honey, and a hint of plums. The finish is long with lingering touches of plums and spice. I'm scoring the Bulleit American Single Malt Whiskey a 92. Next up, Jefferson's Ocean Bourbon. This bourbon claims to be aged at sea and is bottled at 45% ABV. The nose has touches of caramel, nutmeg, honey, and vanilla. The taste has notes of cherry cola, black pepper, honey, and caramel, and the finish is long and spicy with a touch of cherries. There doesn't appear to be much ocean influence on the whiskey itself taste-wise, but I'm scoring Jefferson's Ocean Bourbon a 90. Finally, let's look at the new Green River Rye whiskey from Bardstown Bourbon Company and the Green River Distilling Company. This one is bottled at 47.5% ABV, and the nose has touches of baking spices, molasses, brown sugar, and vanilla. The taste has spicy notes of clove, cinnamon, and black pepper, balanced by brown sugar, apples, and honey. The finish, long with touches of cinnamon apples and honey. I'm scoring the Green River Rye Whiskey a 90. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,600 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
At Dewar's, we're gearing up to unveil a prestigious 4-part collector series of exceptionally high-end blended malts. The first gem in this collection, none other than the extraordinary Dewar's Double 37-year-old, a blended malt that is nothing short of remarkable. The Double 37-year-old undergoes Dewar's cutting-edge 4-stage aging process, meticulously designed to draw out the essence of whiskey barrels dating back to the late 80s. The result? An impeccable balance and a level of smoothness that is off the charts. To pay homage to the Speyside whiskey producing region, it gets an extra tip of the hat, with the finishing process resting in Oloroso sherry casks that once cradled the prestigious Altmore single malt whiskey. As for the taste adventure, brace yourself for captivating notes that include the warmth of cinnamon, the velvety sweetness of heather honey, succulent juiciness of peaches, zesty pops of orange peel, and a decadent shower of brown sugar. And let me be clear, I'm merely giving you a glimpse of the sensational flavor adventure this whiskey has in store. This exceptional whiskey, though, is a rare find, so stay vigilant and find it at a store near you.
Let's open up the WhiskyCast community app and see what people are talking about this week. Our community segment is brought to you by Waterford Whiskey. Had several comments on the Discus report showing flat sales for distilled spirits last year compared to 2022 because of the economy. Rick at the Whiskey Zone posted this on X. Sorry to hear, but not surprised. Dave JS76 agreed with a prediction of his own. Expect to see similar, if not worse, results from much of the rest of the world, Europe in particular. And Butler B posted this in the app. Prices for Irish whiskies also shot up a bunch, at least the ones I purchase. I passed on buying any last year. After I posted the news about the Bulleit American Single Malt on social media this week, we got these comments. From Robin Weston on Facebook, it's American Single Malt, the future of American whiskey. I can't wait for the first 12 to 15-year-old offerings. And Greg David added this, I'm just hoping it does American Single Malt justice. I'm all for commercializing the category, but Lord, I do not want them to destroy its integrity. Looking forward to your notes. Well, you've got my notes now on the show and also at the website, and if you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, share it with us on the WhiskyCast community app. Download it today from the iOS or Android app stores and join the conversation. You can also find us on Threads, X, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, and our email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Our community segment is brought to you by Waterford Whiskey on the web at waterfordwhiskey.com.
That's the sound of our whiskey growing on Dunbell Farm, County Kilkenny. We know where every grain comes from. Only Irish barley, one farm, one terroir at a time. Waterford Whiskey, the most naturally flavoursome single malt.
Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Balcones Distilling. I have to admit that all these years, I've been blaming former President Jimmy Carter for the U.S. switch to metric measurements for alcoholic beverages, but I was wrong. As Aaron Goldfarb writes in his new book, Dusty Booze, it was actually Carter's predecessor, former President Gerald Ford, who started the move to metric measurements after Congress passed the Metric Conversion Act in 1975. Extreme opposition led to the scrapping of the whole thing during the Reagan administration, except for the drinks industry, which made the switch in 1979. However, that does give us one way to date vintage bottles of whiskey. If the label shows a metric measurement, that means it's no older than 1979. But if it comes in a pint or quart-sized bottle, that means it's at least pre-1979 vintage. And by the way, those health warnings from the Surgeon General on U.S. bottles, well, those were added starting in 1989, according to Goldfarb. And while some distillers today still list proof and ABV on their bottles, the ABV requirement did not take effect until 1990. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Balcones Distilling, the original Texas whiskey at the forefront of the American single malt movement, exploring place and provenance with unique style whiskeys, ranging from the award-winning Texas One and Lineage American single malts to their Baby Blue straight corn whiskey and Texas Rye bottled in bond. Discover whiskey from a new perspective at balconesdistilling.com. That's all for this week's episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, and a complete archive of past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on X, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, or you can use the WhiskyCast community app. Download it today from the iOS App Store or Google Play. Our email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Ever go out drinking with a peacock? Always the same. Few too many, tail feathers come out. Drinks get knocked over, bartender's not happy, night's over before it started. All I'm saying is, don't be the peacock in your group.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Dewar's Double Double 37-year-old blended malt whiskey is a true collector's treasure, a rarity worth hunting for and cherishing, perhaps sharing with the lucky few. Please drink responsibly. Copyright 2023, Dewar's Blended Scotch Whiskey, 48% alcohol by volume.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2024, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.